Mpatlanyane, my God.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this, our last seminar, actually what has been, I think, quite an interesting series on university transformation, and I think it's a truly fitting topic on which to end. Our topic today is the politics of representation and power, the individual versus the collective. Of course, we are looking at student politics here, some 3 years after the pivotal FeesMustFall strikes a couple of years ago. We have two student-researchers who have both been through our department. I'd like to introduce you to them respectively. Firstly, we have Vanessa Mpatlanyane, who's just completed an MA titled Transforming the Intellectual, Open Stellenbosch and the Use of Social Media. She's also tutored and is now guest lecturing in a number of positions over the years, so no stranger to most of us. And then Nomzamo, or Nomzi as we know her, Ntombela, who's also studied in the department, who is now Marketing Manager, Academic Affairs Council at Stellenbosch University. More interestingly, she was a member of Open Stellenbosch and then went on to become SRC President, so she has important experience on both sides of this individual versus collective leadership issue, which we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Vanessa to go first. Is that the right order? Okay.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for pitching up. I know people have different commitments, and it's exam season already, and marking, and. So thank you so much for coming. So basically, Nomzi and I really want to invite kind of a discussion around not just student politics per se, but thinking a little bit more about, I guess, student leadership, right, and how that kind of fits into the university. Does it in any way help us think about what the university is, what the state of the university looks like, and also kind of broaden the discussion a little bit more to think about, we all know we have the national elections coming up, right, 2019, so to think about representation a little bit more outside of just the university. So, you know, Nomzi, as Lloyd has said, was in the SRC. She was a president of SRC 2 terms ago, I think. So this has been a very interesting project to work on with her. But we really would like to invite you to think with us. We're still kind of developing these ideas, and we really would appreciate you kind of thinking with us along with us on this. So I want to start off by drawing your attention to something that you may already know, and Lloyd has kind of alluded to it. In 2015, student protests around the country drew international attention to higher education. In the first quarter of the year, various collectives emerged on multiple campuses around the country, of which RhodesMustFall, of course, is easily recognized. But there were other movements that developed during the course of the year. We had Open Stellenbosch here at Stellenbosch University, which kind of emerged around the same time as RhodesMustFall at the first term. Yeah, the first term. You had the Black student movement at Rhodes. They've kept the name, by the way. That's another thing. We have Transform Wits, and of course, Mpatlanyane. You have the Black student stockfall at what was then called the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. They dropped the Metropolitan. You have Transform Picker at Northwest Portia, and you also, of course, here had Tuks-UP uprising at UP. That's just to name a few. Sorry. The specifics of the issues raised by each of the movements varied, however, collectively movements pointed to the cracks in higher education, particularly around issues affecting Black students. While the issues raised by these movements were indeed pressing and crucial, it is worth noting, or rather asking, how is it that in spaces where you had institutionally recognized formal structures of representation, right, in the form of the SRC, you had movements claiming representation of students emerging outside of those structures. And really that is the heart of kind of our point of departure, or the heart of our discussion in this paper or presentation. So I'm going to go to the next, there we go. So there we go. If you forget anything, please remember, take note of this slide. Kind of sums up our thinking in some way. So in this paper, we grapple with a couple of ideas in an effort to account for this occurrence, right? The emergence of movements outside of SRCs. Simply put, we ask why it is that in institutions where there are representative structures or student representative structures in place, there is an alternative representative movement emerging on the periphery. In our attempt to provide a response to this question, we, of course, Nomzamo and I, engage the nature of SRCs, their function and position in universities, as well as the consequence of their position in higher education. Furthermore, we locate SRCs within the broader socio-political context, both historically and the present moment, in a bid to argue that issues around SRCs reflect broader systemic hurdles in terms of representation in democratic South Africa. So again, this is really an invitation to engage on this issue and kind of think a little bit more about what this might mean and what this tells us about representation, and kind of, I guess, in some ways, whether or not, or rather, to think about democracy, right, and what that really means. So I start off here by drawing your attention to the past. I think there are very interesting overlaps between kind of the 2015 student movement, which I focus on intently, and also, you know, activism of the past. Student activism as it emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. I draw attention to this particular period because I think, aside from the fact that a lot of the rhetoric and narratives around the 2015 movements really broadened this period, I think it's very helpful in looking at the similarities. I think they're quite telling. So as it emerged in this period, was intensified by decades of oppression and injustice in South Africa. Over the next 2 decades, the poor conditions of black institutions, as well as the continued oppression and disregard of black people under the apartheid system, would continue to fuel student activism. Resistance to white supremacy and paternalism as displayed by the apartheid government continued to be the concern of student activists and the concerns of unequal opportunities more broadly. The dissemination of anti-colonial ideas on the continent, as well as ideas of Pan-Africanism and black consciousness, changed the vocabulary of students and members of their communities. The ideas of black liberation through self-emancipation and black empowerment strengthened student activism in higher education and in black communities. These sentiments, again, are revived in the 2015 student movements. Following the 1970s, the 1980s saw some of the greatest student resistance efforts under apartheid. Gandhi notes that thousands of young people were detained, whipped, and harassed in 1985, particularly, of course, in the Western Cape. And here, schools continue to be places of political education and awakening. Political repression and repression precipitated acts of resistance from victims. Sit-ins, demonstrations, protests, and the like erupted both on campuses and society at large. But that argues that this period was saturated with widespread mass student, worker, and civil struggles and political campaigns. Students had become militant in their approach, intimidating any form of symbol of authority, leading the then President Portia to declare a partial state of emergency on July 21st, 1985. Throughout this period, the inability to significantly participate in decision-making on issues that impacted them directly and indirectly remained a pressing issue, particularly at black campuses. Pico notes that what was deeply desired beyond black visibility and tokenism on campuses was real black participation. The lack of representation and participation was exacerbated by dynamics within multiracial student formations, in which a lot of students argued black issues and concerns as articulated by black students themselves were granted little attention. And of course, you know, we have to bring USAS into this because it's a very interesting case, right? Within the National Union of Students, South African Students, or NUSAS as it's called, within this formation, this was vividly illustrated. NUSAS, a non-racial national student organization that opposed apartheid policy, was perceived as a platform in which students could gain support on pressing issues at the time, as it offered high numbers and resources. However, on black campuses, debates and contentions arose as some students, most probably because of the influence of black consciousness thinking, argued that affiliation with NUSAS would hinder the black struggle. Person notes that it was the perception of some students that NUSAS, as a predominantly white English organization, was just as invested in protecting white domination, albeit in a less obvious manner. On numerous occasions, the organization had arguably displayed an inability favor of black interests by maintaining passive ways of opposition, even when the situation rendered, or rather required, more aggressive moves. In 1967, at a national NUSAS conference, black students were accommodated separately from their white colleagues. Although NUSAS opposed the segregation, tensions and suspicions that had been brewing within the organization found an outlet, with black students interpreting it as an illustration of the organization's hypocrisy. And of course, this is a very crucial moment that kind of was fundamental, or was crucial in the formation of SASO, right, which is the South African Student Organization. It was also the perception of many black students that their concerns differed from those of white students who made up the bulk of NUSAS. Person writes, I think I have the quotes. There we go, at the bottom. The white students were preoccupied with the whitening away of democratic rights. The blacks' concerns was to secure the most elementary of such rights. The white students did not feel the need to take their political demands outside of campus. The black students were always conscious of the fact that they came from an oppressed majority, and they could not divorce the demand for national liberation from their own student demands. Reddy also suggests or argues that black student leaders believed that NUSAS was more concerned with narrow academic matters than pressing issues faced by black students and academics. This disjunction between students' concerns did not only reflect the immense difference between their lived realities and experiences, that is, of course, of black students and white students, respectively, but demonstrated the lack of significant black representation and power within the organization. As one student put it, it does not help us to see several white black faces in a multiracial gathering, which ultimately concentrates on what the white students believe are the needs of black students. Again, this is very interesting because this is kind of echoed in the most recent student movements as well. This need or wanting to be self-representative and self-emancipating. As NUSAS developed a strained and uncertain relationship with black students, the latter increasingly attended to issues of police brutality, poor infrastructure, and systemic oppression of black campuses across the country. Participation in decision-making was a central issue for student activists, particularly at black campuses, especially since participation in political life at a societal level was virtually non-existent. Indeed, education reflected the structure of power in the broader society, in that at these institutions, students could not fully participate or represent themselves. And even if they did, it wasn't considered to be legitimate. Denied the freedom to be self-determining and effectively involved in decision-making form part of the students' grievances that underpin the revolts. For this reason, in the new democratic period, higher education restructured with the intention of reflecting more closely democratic rights while working towards developmental goals and intentions. In 1997, the government initiated the legitimation of student participation in higher education by institutionalizing, I quote, student involvement in institutional governance, close quote, to redress decades of exclusion, specifically that of black students. The Higher Education Act of 1997 stipulated that all tertiary institutions should have and recognize student representative councils, or SRCs, as legitimate representative bodies. Institutions were mandated to make provision for SRC student leaders in, I quote, the highest decision-making body on strategic issues, the highest academic body, and the highest advisory body. The Act intended to grant more power to the student body through representation in managerial bodies. Student leaders were placed in numerous committees responsible for student well-being and concerns, as well as academic development and student fees. The result of these changes marked a shift from tried and tested means of student dissent and mass protest to formal channels of decision-making. The presence of SRCs in decision-making bodies, however, did not eliminate students' concerns. Janssen notes that at historically black institutions, the concern of students shifted from issues about wider societal freedom and equality to demands for debt relief, greater access to institutions, financial assistance, and access to institutional resources. Again, we've heard this not so long ago. Sorry. At historically white institutions, students battled with issues of institutional culture, language of instruction, and racial integration, particularly at historically Afrikaans institutions. SRCs were presented as the only channel through which to negotiate and air student grievances. As a result, protest action and public demonstrations were perceived as acts of rebellion, while roundtable discussions were regarded as legitimate. Student grievances expressed outside of formalized channels such as the SRCs or those initiated by the SRC were strongly condemned by fellow students and management, with unrest receiving a stringent response from government-backed institutional management. Student activism through movements and organizations thus became highly policed, both by institutional policies and other students, which of course deemed protest action and demonstration as illegitimate modes of political expression. In effect, the SRC had become the only legitimate representative and voice of the student body at institutions, and indeed that which the state recognized. So, Nomzi, please go to the next slide. I thought this was a very interesting diagram to kind of illustrate the position of the SRC within the institution. And I don't think this is exceptional to Stellenbosch University, right? Because the Higher Education Act of '97 kind of positions SRC in this way. So the first point number 1 and 3 are quite interesting, I think, and I think we can have a bit of a discussion on that later on. But in accounting for the emergence of movements or alternative representative structures outside of the SRC, I think those 2 points are quite telling and might kind of give us some sort of indication why this has happened. So, accounting for its emergence separate from the SRC, Open Stellenbosch, which was the movement here at Stellenbosch University, stated that it arose due to, I quote, the lack of action on the part of management, the SRC, and the broader university community in relation to incidents of racist violence on campus and in town. So this was the first statement that they issued after the McDonald's incident. So there was kind of a racial altercation and, I guess, attack at McDonald's. And so around that time, Open Stellenbosch kind of emerged. They later on throughout the year kind of expanded on this definition, and not just in reference to racist violence, but also other issues including fees and other sorts of violences, I suppose. So according to Open Stellenbosch, the SRC was not an adequate representative structure, as it failed to adequately address issues of racism and exclusion experienced by Black students. Throughout the 2015-2016 year, the rift between the SRC and the movement was exacerbated by multiple incidents during student protests, among which was an incident involving the SRC, or then SRC chairperson, and student between the SRC chairperson and student activists during FeesMustFall. Right? So I think before I read what happened, right, the account, okay, let me read it, actually, before I kind of get into it. Okay. So during one of Open Stellenbosch sit-ins, student activists demanded that the SRC chairperson retract his comment that the chosen mode, he had said, right, that the chosen mode of protest was unnecessary and the wrong way of going about things. So, hours prior to the chairperson's address, students had tactfully made their way into the main administrative building, which is Admin B, right over there, initiating a sit-in. Singing and vibrant discussions became the strategy of students as they showed their solidarity with other movements around the country, protesting for free education as part of the FeesMustFall campaign. As the day ended, questions about the presence, or rather the absence, of the SRC circulated among students in the building. Looking at some of the SRC members present at the occupation, students asked, "Where is the rest of the SRC? We want to know when the others are getting here. We keep seeing the same faces. Why isn't the SRC mandated to be here?" The question not only overtly marked the absence of the SRC at the occupation, but further raised questions about the commitment of the SRC to these issues. Okay. In response to this question, the SRC and the SRC's presence more generally, the SRC chairperson finally made his way to the building. This was like hours later. A round of applause followed while students waited for his address. Songs of praise and encouragement directed at the chairperson preceded the address. The chairperson began by assuring students of his commitment and solidarity with them. However, he stated that the illegal occupation of the administrative building was not the way to fix things. In absolute disapproval, an uproar broke out over the comment. One student shouted, I quote, "I think the chairperson has misunderstood the mandate. The mandate is for him to bring management to us. They must come here to us. We are sending him to bring them here." Students argued that the chairperson had misunderstood why he was summoned to the occupation and thus needed to be reminded. Amidst the uproar, a message claiming that the SRC chairperson had written a letter to the rector's management team further strained an already tense situation. It was announced to activists and students who were present at the sit-in that the chairperson's letter, found by some other students at the same occupation, stated that students should be removed from the building. In response to this, the chairperson argued that the letter was an appeal to management to remove students in a dignified and non-violent manner. He asserted that the institution had already called for interdicts and removal of students from the building. This was, of course, not convincing, and instead, students asserted or responded to the chairperson by saying that he was no longer a fit guardian of their interests, he was no longer fit to be an SRC chairperson, and because he didn't demonstrate any commitment to protecting their interests or protecting them, right? He didn't stand in solidarity with them. Consequently, students called for the chairperson to be removed from office, which resulted in an emergency student parliament shortly thereafter. The question directed at the SRC present at the occupation was a question about the extent of the SRC's commitment to the fees issue, but not just the fees issue, but the issues that students would bring up more generally. In other words, students wanted to know whether the SRC was willing to support marginalized students, and to what extent they were willing to do that. Even though the SRC was considered a useful channel through which the whole student body could be reached, tensions escalated throughout the year, creating a conducive environment for distrust and disregard for the SRC as an ally in the struggle against institutional and interpersonal exclusion at the university. Nairi suggests that this rift may be accounted for by considering the politics and political affiliations of students who are within the SRC. Although students campaign for the SRC in their personal capacity, often their political affiliations and political parties back them, right? Their affiliations to political parties and political societies are not forfeited. The impact that student leaders themselves, or their personal values, political affiliations, their politics basically, and social commitments have on their decisions and priorities while in office cannot be overlooked as a stumbling block in representation, right? Noting this, student activists at SU, Stellenbosch University, have drawn attention to the lack of black working class students on the SRC, and were more likely distrustful of the SRC and the chairperson, particularly in this instance, because they felt underrepresented within the structure. Students perceived that the SRC neglected their interests because they could not identify or relate with them. Many activists saw the chairperson, one of the few black men in the SRC, as reinforcing the patriarchal tendencies of that organization. His perceived middle-class status arguably further distanced him from the struggle of working-class black students. As one student said to the chairperson, "You simply do not understand." Although the chairperson responded by stating that I too am on a bursary, his perceived middle-class position, and indeed the fact that a significant number of the SRC members were absent from the student activist efforts, was perceived as insincere. Furthermore, there's something to be said of the institutional position of the SRC, in addition to the individual policies of SRC members. Taylor proposes that SRCs are actually not as powerful as they may seem, right? Or we'd like to think they are. He argues that the formalization of SRCs, although aimed at creating a space for student participation in higher learning, has in fact gained more success in silencing unrest and less in solving student grievances and adequate representation. Differently put, the absorption of student representatives onto decision-making bodies did not necessarily result in equal and significant participation of student leaders in these bodies, because they now have to play by the rules of the institutions of which they form part, right? Right, so as the statute outlines, the SRC represents students subject to the authority of council. As the highest strategic body at an institution, council has a lot of power, right? So the SRC has 2 seats on council, which is made up of plus 30 people. However, if council itself is characterized by conservative members with arguably adverse interests to those of minority students, the power of the SRC is significantly diminished. That is, SRC members on council become representatives, or just, I guess, figures with diminished participatory power necessary to advance the interests of its students. So this makes me think about what Pico asserted earlier on, right? About not just about the issue, not just being about black visibility or tokenism, but real, participation and ability to participate. Okay, almost there. How much time? Oh, okay. So I'm gonna skip then, because I am definitely out of time. So kind of just to move a little bit further into what Nomzamo is going to talk about. So I've kind of highlighted, or really attempted to highlight and draw attention to the fact that representation is not a question that is kind of contemporary or new, right? It can be historically located. I've also tried to provide some ways in which the emergence of the movements outside of the SRC can be explained. But in response to this, we're kind of starting to think about what is it about the SRC, right, and its position in the university. What is it that inhibits or limits its response to the needs of minority students? In response, I have suggested that perhaps it is the individual interests and values of members of the SRC, as well as the place of the SRC within the university. I do think that even though these are kind of, some considerations, this is not the whole story. I think there's something to be said about being within the institution that may be limiting and restrictive to SRCs and in terms of representing minority students. But also I think this may be indicative of a larger issue, and that's actually Nomzamo's part. She's gonna handle that.
Thank you, Vanessa. Oh wow, now you leave me in okay. As Vanessa has already stated, so interestingly enough, I've been within and on the outside of the structures. So it's quite interesting that I found myself in this position. But part of it was from my experiences outside of the SRC structure and also within the structure that got me thinking around this issue of representation and how it is something much more bigger than sort of what we understand, and how also this can be used as a mirror to sort of try and interpret how we find ourselves as a society in South Africa, and a democratic society in South Africa. And if you saw from the abstract, I used a very interesting term there of, this disillusioned democracy, which I'll attempt to unpack in the time that I have. But if you have any more questions, you're more than welcome to chat to me afterwards, because there's a lot of these are just ideas. I just want to put that out. These are ideas for reflection, and I really do ask and invite everyone to sort of be on this journey of reflection. Some of these ideas you'll see are, one would term them as radical. I find them rather normal ideas that, not only have I been thinking through them, but also other people sort of within the spaces that I found myself in have been thinking of. So this was an image that was utilized at WITS, and it states, "Why pay SRC sucks," which is quite interesting. So the first thing that I'm sort of going to start from is sort of trying to define what institutional culture is, and sort of try use institutional culture sort of a means to interpret the culture we find ourselves within society in South Africa. So one of the things that we assert is that we need to move away from this model of understanding apartheid as having a system, but to understand it as a culture, and to understand it as a culture in terms of how these different notions and also different symbols in cultures, how we understand it. In anthropology, we speak of these things. Just putting it out there, I mentioned anthropology. But sort of think of it as a culture, sort of see how it's culminated into the different aspects of everyday life that we find ourselves in. And not just to think of it as sort of, this sort of in-your-face segregation, but to be sort of the euphemisms that we use in everyday life, the language, the institutional culture, which many of the student movements sort of sought to address, to speak out against. You know, people are saying we want the Rhodes statue down, not just because it's a statue, we don't like it, but because of what that statue represents. And sort of that's how I'm sort of inviting you to understand this apartheid culture and sort of how institutionally this culture is still, you know, permanent and still there as well. And in sort of the geopolitics of this institutional culture, as Vanessa mentioned, there's also something about how you've got your historically white institutions and also historically black institutions. And how does sort of representation play out? How is this culture different? Because you don't have, you know, just one culture at Stellenbosch University, which is sort of, you know, that in-your-face apartheid culture, but we have other institutions and such culture is still also very, you know, prevalent, but we obviously don't use the same words and terminology for it, which is also something that came up during, you know, these movements. People are saying institutional culture, some people are saying totally different things. So it's also just bringing you to sort of think around that and how, you know, the fact that people are bringing up different things, you know, some institutions are seen as being intellectual hubs, you know, during the movement, some were seen as sort of being places for privilege. Stellenbosch is one of the places where, you know, students are saying, you know, across the country and even across the province, you know, if you need resources, just go to Stellenbosch, because we had that pool of resources. So we were sort of that, I want to call it, let's just call it a hub of privilege in, you know, in that sense. So, you know, we were in a student movement fighting for equality and so forth, but you saw different types of representation, different types of cultures sort of emanating from within these movements that can be said to be reminiscent of this culture that I spoke of. And then also the individual and the culture. So something that Vanessa also brought up was sort of how, if you look at our SRCs, you mustn't only see the SRCs just as being sort of this one unified, you know, body, but that there's actual individuals within this SRC. And what, you know, who is this individual within the SRC itself? You know, I come onto the SRC as being, you know, candidate X, but who am I as candidate X coming from? Sort of, what is my positionality, ideologically, what is my, you know, as was mentioned with the previous chairperson, you know, what is my class that I come from, what is my gender that I come from, and sort of how do these things play out when we sit around that round table and we try and make decisions. You know, there's that tension that comes through, but what is sort of the drive for that tension that comes across? Is it always necessarily sort of an institutionalized thing of saying, you know, we need to play by the rules, and sort of how do these things sort of play out in these conversations that we have, and sort of representation as well? Because how do I go to a conversation as an SRC member, because you're elected by students, you're given this institutional power, this mandate, you know, you sit there on council, I can make decisions, but also my power is limited, and sort of why is that power limited? And then the collective and the culture, we stated, was sort of the higher education institutions themselves and the state as well. And sort of how do these bodies sort of, you know, what in these bodies sort of mirrors each other? What can we see from how our higher education institutions operate that we can see and sort of relate to how the state is also operating in terms of addressing inequalities, in terms of hearing, you know, sort of the marginalized voices? Is our state able to, you know, fully encapsulate and hear these types of voices, given the type of democracy that we have in South Africa, and are higher education institutions also able to do this? So I'm just trying to run through everything, sorry. And then representation and power, which was a big part of our paper. So student movements in the 60s and 70s primarily sought freedom. They sought to address sort of freedom for people, and people wanted to say, we want to feel as if we belong, we want to be a part of this country. And our state as well, which is a democratically elected state, we argue has a political power. Because as one person said in a conversation earlier this year at the University Museum, we fought for power, we fought for freedom, but we only got political power. We only got political freedom. What does that mean in terms of a state that is meant to be independent? You know, who does the state depend on for economic power, for social power, and so forth? And this also perhaps goes into, you know, the notions of the Broederbond, of, you know, other people controlling sort of that aspect, and how does that control that they have over economic power, for example, influence the political power and the exercise of this political power that the state has? And also, there's also a class element that comes into sort of this understanding of democracy, especially at an institutional level and also in a government level, of how in 1994 when people went to vote, not everyone had the same understandings and notions of what democracy was and what democracy entailed. Thus, there were different expectations that people have, which is also similar to how in institutions, when people go vote for the SRC, people aren't voting for the same things. Because, you know, when you campaign as an SRC member, I can promise you free iNet key, which is things that Stellenbosch students normally want. I promise you iNet key, I promise you fixing of the shuttles and so forth. So I'm promising you these material things, and you're going and you're voting in hopes of attaining that. But it's certain classes that are sort of, can't find the English word, but are sort of drawn to these types of, these types of promises. And it's also determined by what classes they come from, it determines what you're going to be drawn for when you go and you sit there on the ballot box in South Africa, or you go on to Sunderland and you vote for the SRC. And what does it say about the representation that we have? Because people don't understand what they're voting for, what it is that they are going to vote for. And those themselves who stand don't necessarily also have those similar understandings. So I can be an SRC member and tell people vote for me, whatever the case may be, and I'm really standing there because I want to sort of tick it off in my, my CV. I want to say I stood for the SRC. But there are those also who go into these positions also hoping to attain a different type of power, which is sort of to move them into the state sort of power of, going and working for political party X someday because I was standing in the SRC and so forth, which perhaps Stephen can speak to with these interesting people that he engages with. But, sort of this democratic election of the SRCs, as, you've heard, there's sort of something about how these SRCs are elected and the similarities to how our government officials are elected that tells you something about sort of the limits of representation and the limits of democracy as well, and how they acted on our university campuses. And an interesting thing that was also brought up during FeesMustFall and in other student movements as well was that people didn't want the SRC to be the ones who sort of led these structures. Even though, it was said that these are your student representative councils, they are elected by you, but students said, we don't want you to speak for us because we, some movements said we understand that you are limited, you are within the institution, you are within the structure. You work with the structure and we do not want that. We want you to work for our interests. And because of how difficult it is to navigate sort of these types of things, some SRCs were sort of disbanded. Students said, we don't want you, we will speak for ourselves. And some SRC members in their individual capacities joined these student movements. So they sort of said, okay, I'm going to leave this, this formalized structure that I've been elected in, and I'm going to stand as candidate X and support this specific movement. And what does that sort of say about the power of the SRC itself? If we are supposed to be this unified banded structure, and now I as candidate X leave, whichever, regardless of the position that I have, where's this unified, representative structure that I'm supposed to be working within itself? But also another thing is when I leave this formalized sort of representative council structure and I join the movement, who do I then become within the movement? And is it possible, to sort of stand there and listen to the conversations, contribute, and then go back to my council and be expected to report back because they're going to say, okay, candidate X, you went to the mass meeting that was going on, what are students saying? Sort of where do you draw those individual interests and collective interests, more especially of which collective? Because now you're an SRC member, but you're also in, I'm going in my individual capacity to be a FeesMustFall member, for example. So whose interest and whose voice am I actually representing, and at what point as well? So we're sort of trying to find, trying to highlight those individual conflicts that exist within people within these movements, especially within the student representative councils themselves, which have this limited power. And then, so sort of just to end off the conversation, like I said, you're more than welcome to ask questions. Please do ask questions. Sort of other things that we're sort of thinking through is also that many student movements brought up the notion of, we want to decolonize, we want to decolonize the curriculum and so forth. But not many movements are sort of speaking of Africanization, which is another concept, that's very prominent and a conversation that's happening around a lot. So we said, decolonization for Africanization or decolonization versus Africanization, and I can expand on this further in the question session. But also, could the call for representation within structures be a form of articulation of a sense of belonging? So this wanting to belong and, within the country and within the institutions themselves. Because many, students, black students more especially, said, I don't feel like I belong within this institution. I don't feel like I'm meant to be in this institution. Some students were even saying, it's a social burden to walk around as a black student within a higher education institution. Many of these students, not many of them necessarily, but some of them being from Stellenbosch itself, in the Leicester video, for example. And, what does this say? Students want to belong, but where can they belong? And is it possible for them to belong in institutions that are reminiscent and carry these symbols and euphemisms of an up-to-date, sort of nationalistic, capitalistic identity? Within really the conflicted nature of identity politics in South Africa, with this nation of, we're meant to be this rainbow nation, but how does the rainbow nation sort of encapsulate, and can it encapsulate all the different identities and complexities that people have and are sort of working through. Because what we have, what we have is sort of this, when one is growing up, your consciousness and who you are and your identity is sort of crafted and molded for you by sort of the spaces you find yourselves within. But when you come to a higher education institution, you no longer have those similar things. So it's this thing of where you have to rebuild your identity. But how do you sort of rebuild and structure your identity in a place where you sort of feel like you don't belong, and there's no familiarities, and sort of these constant reminders, you know, that you actually don't belong here, or you don't actually have a voice, whether it be overt or covert in that nature. So thank you very much for listening to these ideas, and yeah, we will take questions now.
Thank you very much, Vanessa and Nomzi. Okay, we are open for questions. Let's take three. Maybe just tell us who you are.
There's no question.
We have 5C1. We have a couple more.
I didn't want to start by asking two questions. First of all, I'd like to say it really is an important and an issue that really needs a lot of thought and a lot of discussion. And I was very impressed. My first question simply is, having been earlier this year at the University of Venda for a week, where there is a former doctoral student who is teaching there, and she invited me, and having spoken somewhat about their SRC, and having a friend at the University of Fort Hare, Robert Mongwe, it's clear in those two cases that the issue of party political affiliation of SRCs is important. I mean, everybody knows of Fort Hare, so that's my first question. Where are you on the issue of ought SRCs to be party politically involved and to gain? That's my first question. The second is more generally in terms of decolonization for Africanization. Mahmoud Mamdani, who we know well, is an African social critic in the United States, has recently written a long article on the African University in the London Review of Books, which I've got if you'd like to see it, and that's where my second question comes from. Both of you said we need to look at the African continent. We need to look at Africanization. At the same time, we know that South Africa has been treated as an exception over the years, and apartheid was in some senses an exception. But there is an argument that since 1994 we are becoming increasingly comparable to other African institutions and other African countries. That's my question, but let me just give you two quotes from this article by Mamdani. He writes, "It is striking in the post-colonial era how little the modern African university has to do with African institutions. It draws its inspiration from the colonial period and takes as its model the discipline-based, gated community that maintains a distinction between clearly defined groups, administrators, academics, and fee-paying students. The African university, in other words, began as part of the European colonial mission, a precursor of the one-size-fits-all initiative that we associate with the World Bank." He's saying generally, and I mean, he was at the University of Cape Town for 2 or 3 years, some 10 years back, if I remember correctly, 15 maybe. So he does bring South Africa into it. He finishes, this is a second quote, "The spread of higher education in Africa is a post-independence phenomenon." Then he says, exceptionally, "Only in South Africa, Egypt, and the Maghreb," that's North Africa, "can the number of universities founded in the colonial period be counted on more than 2 hands." He's saying that South Africa became, to use your term, the new democratic period, later than many of the African universities. And being later, there is this colonial imprint that you don't find for many universities between North Africa and South Africa. So the general question is, do you feel you should try and locate what you've been speaking about, both generally as well as SRC student leadership, in a wider African continental context. And sorry, I took a long time.
As usual, that's fine.
Should we take? I'm Matthew, I'm doing my master's here. I just wanted to ask more, you guys pose the SRC and Open Stellenbosch almost in an antagonistic relationship, right? And yes, I'm sure that's very easy to imagine. You guys definitely made sense of that, and I agree with you. But why can't we, or maybe it's a useful thing to think about the SRC as almost an administrative, bureaucratic, it has this validity within the structures of the university, and then there's a popular representation and an emotive validity with Open Stellenbosch. So I don't think they have to be cast as total opposites, and the SRC could even just be used as a mediator to voice the students' concerns on the ground as the working class students, not excluding those two things. So Nomzamo, can I pose that to you?
Choose an answer.
Oh, okay.
There are questions behind you, but it's
Oh, do you want to check?
we can answer next week.
There's quite a mouthful there.
So it's okay. Do you want to go? Shall I go? Okay, C1, difficult question. The first one, particularly whether or not SRCs should be not politically affiliated, I suppose. I've been struggling with that question and trying to weigh the pros and the cons. And fortunately, we have kind of, two examples. At Stellenbosch University, for example, people kind of campaign on the personal capacity, and if you campaign under a party or a society or whatever, there's, all these procedures and get disqualified, right? A couple of years ago, a couple of posters went around campus, Anthropology students, and there was a whole big spiel about there's a violation of one kind or another. But also in other places, you have, like you said, at Venda, at Portia, I believe it's the same at FIS as well now, at UJ and so forth, you have people campaigning under kind of political banner. I don't have a hard, fast answer. I'm still thinking through it, but I do think what is central, whether or not you campaign under political banner or not, is the consideration of the student body as not this homogeneous group, right? That there is a variety and diversity of backgrounds and interests. And I think it's the same thing even with movements. The consideration is, or the question really is, who and what takes priority? And so I think at different moments, certain interests must take priority, right? For the sake of transformation, for the sake of, decolonization. But then, again, as an SRC, it is difficult to really do very much because there's really these very narrow rules. You're really subjected to all these institutional regulations and, really in a tight spot. So I don't have a hard, fast answer, but that's just my thinking around it as I consider it a bit more. So it's neither a yes or a no immediately from me. Maybe I'll have a different response in a couple of weeks. And then positioning the university within kind of a broader, a particular South African university, as the colonial imprint still lingers on this university particularly. That has been very useful, and hence I think that's why we suggested kind of not just thinking about moving away from just thinking about decolonization, right, as almost a stripping away of something, this breaking free, gaining independence, and moving towards something rather, like there's a goal, right, Africanization rather, as opposed to just thinking about decolonization as the end and all, like that's what we want, that's where we're stopping. But because then the question is, okay, so that happens, and then what? Do we toss everything? Do we burn everything? What do we do? So I think thinking framing it within Africanization, it offers some kind of move towards something. There's a bit more hope, I think, and it's a little more promising. It kind of, yeah. So, no, so do you want to say something?
No.
No. Okay. Matthew, you can
Yeah. I think I just want to add to the first question about the politicization of campuses and so forth. So it is something that we definitely went through and sort of debated and so forth for weeks. And recently, I think about 2 weeks ago, there was a debate actually on ENCA regarding should SRCs be politicized or not. And there was a former SRC, the Vice President, was on it with the Dean of Students of UNISA. And one of the sentiments that was brought across was that to belong to a political student structure can be restrictive, and you end up being in a situation where your own personal, so that notion of individual versus collective values and goals are compromised for the goal of the political organization, which is the collective. So I think it restricts people when, you know, they come from these political parties, because it restricts a person in one sense, but also in the other sense, depending on what party they come from, it backs them with an ideology that they can sort of stand on. So in institutions like, let me use UWC as an example. So they have formations that we don't have here on our own campus ourselves. So they have formations like PASMA and so forth. And some of these movements sort of are founded in sort of black consciousness, black liberation and so forth, which in some campuses is necessary. Sort of how, you know, the campuses, students aren't in this homogeneous sort of structure. So it helps students in sort of a sense of that they have a political ideology, which I believe is necessary sort of in a context like South Africa, because ideology informs who you are as an individual, sort of what decisions you take. However, if it's coming from a party, or should I say a party like AfriForum, for example, or there's these other ones that are very problematic, you know, you come with this sort of very problematic mindset, which informs you to make decisions that are for a set sort of, you know, privileged collective. So it gives you an empowerment, but it also restricts you, because then you're sort of expected by the collective, which mandated you to sit on the structure, to make decisions that align with their own sort of collective interests and desires and wants. So if the collective promised students that they will get free INET key or free accommodation, whatever the case may be, within the following academic year, which is sort of mandates that many collectives use when they're running, you're sort of restricted. Now when you get there and you see, okay, structurally it's not feasible, it's not going to happen. But now, you know, you sort of find yourself in a position of, what do I do now? And sort of it furthers this tension and divide that people sort of have within these sort of politicized structures, and sort of within the SRC itself as this collective that's meant to exist. So I think, like Vanessa said, we don't really have an answer of whether they should be or they shouldn't be, but I think it's something worth thinking through, like you've stated, that we've been thinking through, and I think nationally now as well, as I mentioned at the debate, is actually being thought through by many people post FeesMustFall, sort of how do we sort of handle these types of, you know, conflicts that might arise from these types of things. And then I think for the other question, I think I didn't necessarily speak on Open Stellenbosch. Vanessa did, but I think it's, I mean, at that moment itself, if we look back at 2015, I think the ideology that the SRC had sort of as a collective, there was no collective ideology, sort of collective, and I think there wasn't time for to be a formation of a collective goal, of a collective interest, because, I mean, the SRC came into power, it was in September of that previous year in 2014, I think 2014, yeah, and then 2015 came, and I think, I mean, it's, when you get into SRC, it's usually the fourth term, so it's September, October, November, December, January, February, bam, there's Open Stellenbosch, couple of months later, bam, there's FeesMustFall. So I think that there was no time for the SRC then to sort of form sort of a collective identity as well, sort of what do we want to achieve as an SRC, and sort of how do we go about it, but also given the individual interests and ideologies of members of the SRC at that time, also put them in a very conflicted position. Because I think at that time as well, on a national scale, individuals hadn't really started sort of questioning what is a black identity, what is sort of what is a minority, because I think up until then there was sort of this illusionment of we lived in this, you know, democratic, equal, you know, representative state. People hadn't started questioning why, and then I think, and
I think I want to correct myself, that people had been questioning it on other campuses, you know, black institutions, historically black institutions, had been questioning this issue of access, institutional culture and so forth. I think on a campus like Stellenbosch and other campuses as well, which were historically white deliver institutions, such questions hadn't really come about. You know, we'd been in this phase, you know, mostly as individuals in these institutions themselves, where we didn't know who we were. You know, for me, I always say, when I'm in KZN, I know I'm black, but I don't feel I'm black. But when I come to Stellenbosch, not only do I know I'm black, I feel like I'm black. So it was sort of this thing of where we hadn't started confronting what it is to be black, or to be dispossessed, or to be, you know, to not belong. You know, it was sort of these euphemisms that were used here at Stellenbosch, more especially, that we need to create our community, we need to have another skalkel, we need to do whatever the case may be, but sort of let's sweep under, you know, let's forget about someone got beat up at McDonald's, it was racialized. No, it was normalized. We normalized those types of things. So I think for me, I don't think that they have to necessarily be opposing. I don't. I think the one can sort of enable the other or empower the other, but I think it goes back to those individuals within sort of the SRC, for example, and also within OS themselves. When I look at OS back then, of sort of the willingness to work together to achieve that goal. I think it goes back, but just like I said, then I don't think it was possible, as Vanessa mentioned.
Matthew, I just also want to just kind of work through the timeline a little bit. So you have, like, Noms is a very good example of this, right? She goes, literally, the next year becomes the SRC president, and she was in Stellenbosch a few months before that. So you kind of see a very interesting thing happen, right? So you have a lot of Open Stellenbosch people that start running for SRC and running for other leadership positions on campus and so forth. But I think Open Stellenbosch had to happen first, because they had to be something that would literally shake this campus, right? Break something so that something else could grow in that crevice, right? I think it was not something that was possible before. I certainly know when I was in first year, I was like one of 5 black women in my race of 100+ women, right? And instead of, I had to sit with a translator because everything was in Afrikaans, and the newsletters and everything had to have someone, my roommate who was Afrikaans speaking, translate everything. And it was just like, this is just what it is. This is Stellenbosch. This is just how it is, you know. So I imagine that, sure, you can have an SRC that has, you know, woke people, so, you know, so to speak. But I think that something has to happen first to get to that point. And I think where Stellenbosch was before 2015, there was no space for that. And also, once those people are within the structure, it's really, you have this real push and tug, because you're there knowing what you're there for, right? You're there because you want change, you want transformation, you want diversity, and. But there is always a pushback, and you can anticipate that there's a pushback.
Sure. Yes. 1, 2, 3.
So my question is with regards to the residents and the house committees. So when I look at it, it almost seems like the SRC, because of the decentralized management systems or student leader systems, it's almost like the res or the university accesses the students and further perpetuates this institutional culture and marginalization of minority students through the resident systems, which is the predominant structures that sort of have influence in the culture of the campus. So then, and it's almost like the SRC is literally just a name, or just, we have it because the Constitution says this. And it only takes care of the outlying cases. And when you're desperately about to be kicked out of campus, then you approach the SRC. Then you realize that, oh, we have an SRC. And I think this is evident in the participation in voting for the SRC. The numbers were pathetic, you know, which sort of questions the legitimacy or how much power the SRC has even in the decision making. And I'm also speaking about now the Prim Committee, which has so much influence on what happens within the student communities and the culture again. So I guess my question is, what then of those communities and what influence do they have in addressing the needs of students that are a minority and marginalized students?
Go to the question.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I kind of, it's a sort of a comment, and I'm gonna, as I'm talking, I'll fashion it into a question. So I hear there are multiple things going on in your paper. So there's a touch on some of the theory, and I want to comment a lot more on the theoretical side. And so when we use terms like decolonization or even Africanization, because you have such a wealth of data and such a wealth of lived experience, I think it's really important in the publication of whatever you're presenting, or even in the presentation of what you're presenting, to unpack those terms. They're quite loaded, decolonization, and it's also maybe piggybacking on Simon's comment. Institutions of higher learning in the rest of the continent, I think, are firmly stamped in the decolonizing framework because they emerged just as states were being decolonized, whereas South Africa, we moved through a like quasi-colonized state and moved directly into apartheid, and apartheid borrowed a lot from systems of colonization. And so I think South Africa has something that's particularly different in the way institutions of higher learning are formed, and then the different iterations of student movements on different campuses also speak to the historicity of how South Africa was partitioned and how the education system developed out of those partitions. And I like what you're saying about Africanization. So in the phrasing Africanization, is it making an assumption that what's happened on the is it a geographical, are you locating it ideologically in terms of a post-colonial idea of what it is to be African, or is it a geographic
sense of Africanization? And if that's the case, if it's here on the continent, it's part of Africa. So UCT is an African university. So I think it's just to keep it in mind. And then also, if we are thinking around the theory that spoke most clearly to me was critical race theory, and a lot of the ways, the trajectories really that South Africa and institutions of higher learning are moving through, critical race theory is developed in America, and so what I'm interested in is how in South Africa we can not do a translation per se, to actually conceive of our own idea of what critical race theory looks like, because it will have a different face in South Africa. And I would be so thrilled to follow your work and see how you're using these experiences that you've had to think very clearly and critically around what it means to belong as a black person or a brown person or a person of color. Even those phrases and those terms, are they relevant for us? And then I think most importantly, what's happened in the education structure of South Africa is that certainly post-94 there was a movement towards the equity index, and the ministries of education have had that as their stalwart guide, and that what it has become is almost like a blackface. So you place lots of people of, you tick diversity because there's multiple numbers of Indian folk, black, colored, whatever it is. But then there's an interesting article written by Boy et al. I can't remember the other two, it's terrible. But it was really interesting because it spoke particularly to what you raise here, which is the culture, which is also a piece of question about splitting the SRC and Open University. The issue is not so much about splitting and taking roles of who does what, but it's more the institutional culture, and that institutional culture is firmly situated in quite a racist shaping and also quite a patriarchal, white supremacist way of thinking, which is absolutely difficult to move out of. And so that ideological aspect of your paper and your presentation, I would love to see more, and also perhaps maybe the question is, what are the tools, how are you thinking through that? Because rather than focusing on something that is
deontological. I think maybe if you thought through something around the ontology of what it means to have leadership at institutions and how that would look.
Okay. I'm still thinking through this, but my question is broadly around what about now, right? If you pose the student movement, Open Stellenbosch, so as a pushback, a collective pushback against lack of representation of student interests and so on. And I'm just thinking about also the response of the university to that particular pushback and so on, which certainly in my estimation is ongoing, right? And here I'm thinking about my question is broadly around what has happened to that collectivity.
Okay.
And the responses by the university I'm thinking of is the actual appointment of some of the women involved in Open Stellenbosch into positions in the university, especially in the transformation office, and how that certainly in conversations with many of those women have led to a sense of demobilization and cooptation. But also ongoing court cases against some student activists and so on. So, yeah, my question is where is Open Stellenbosch and where is the collective right now?
Okay, which one are we going to talk about first? Okay, let's talk about institutional culture. Let's talk about institutional culture. So the question is also around institutional culture.
First, I'm going to respond. Thank you for the comment. Thank you so much. I'm going to take it as we're going to take it as a comment. We're going to take it as a comment because you certainly do point out some of the things we should be thinking about a little more, I guess, seriously and more intently. I get it's a comment, so it's a little bit weird to, and thank you for pointing out some things we should be reading. With regards, I'm going to work backwards because now I remember. Where is Open Stellenbosch now? I must tell you, the last chapter of my thesis is the demise of Open Stellenbosch. It's so sad. It felt like I was putting it in the ground, and it is nowhere, right? To be quite frank and honest, the collective as it was in 2015 is no longer, right? But certainly the impact is seen, right? The impact lingers. Some good, some bad. As you rightfully pointed out, some people still are carrying court cases and disciplinary action from, 3 years ago? Now it's 3 years ago. So there's that. A lot of the students also that were in Open Stellenbosch have left the institution. Some willfully, some not, because of the university taking legal action and so on. And some people have been absorbed into the system, which, again, this is why I'm a bit, thinking about Matthew's question, hesitant to have, people go into the SRC, or because I really do think it is demobilizing. I do think it's disempowering to some extent, right? Because it doesn't matter how many faces or what faces you put into these structures. If they are there literally just as a face, it does nothing. So, yes, and the university's response, not shockingly, of course, to Open Stellenbosch was, of course, Men in Black, as you'd anticipate, which were the private security that came in, which is another story altogether. And I think, Nomzi, you can pick up more on that because, wow. So you had that, and also, interestingly, I think the university is, because of the 100 years also, I don't know, is using that as in an interesting way to paint this, oh, we've recovered picture, or we are recovering picture, we are doing more picture. So, yeah, that is, I don't know how much detail you want, that, yeah. Do you want to say?
Yeah. I think, so Vanessa has said a lot, but I think there's one, so I've briefly read Vanessa's thesis, and I think the demise is perhaps, it's a very loaded word to utilize. I think for me, I'd say it's perhaps mutated. I think, like I said, it's mutated into something sort of bigger. So I wouldn't necessarily say that OS is sort of, dead or whatever the case may be. I think it's sort of mutated into something else. Because even though we're not seeing the collective, sort of, in 2015 where there were late night thoughts and things like that, even though we're not seeing the collective, in terms of numbers and so forth, the conversations are sort of still happening, on the ground. People are still engaging with some of the texts and so forth. And I think it's happening perhaps more in quiet spaces, sort of not in, because I think lots of people face victimization in 2015, 2016 and so forth. And I think many people are also seeing the consequences of such a victimization, especially in a space like Stellenbosch, because not necessarily everyone was, suspended or expelled, or whatever the case may be, but there's some people who faced, I know of people who lost bursaries, for example, and things like that. So I think it's, I think OS is still alive, perhaps not in, and I think that's sort of one of the things we sort of, spoke on, of sort of what is the movement and who is the movement. And I think the what is sort of what you're sort of going towards here. We're not seeing the movement sort of in your face and things like that, but sort of the movement is still there because the conversations are happening. I think recently, I won't mention when I was even having conversations with people of sort of, what's going on, campuses changed, there's this notion that, the movement has died or whatever, critical thought has died, but it's actually still there. I think it's sort of I'd say this is a dormant phase, that's the word, right? Dormant phase. I'd say it's one of a dormant phase of the movement, but there's definitely still conversations and movements sort of happening on the ground that are sort of inspired or sort of draw on, conversations from Open Stellenbosch, because people weren't speaking of intersectionality and all of those things before Open Stellenbosch. People didn't even know what that was, and I think to a certain extent there are some people still don't know what it means. But anyway, we have those terms sort of out there, and like the university has expropriated some of these terms. I mean, yesterday, as a means of trying to distress before the presentation, I thought I'd do something different. So I attended an exhibition that was happening at the University Museum, 100 artifacts for 100 years. And interestingly enough, I don't even forget, it was item number 73 on that list, was even there. There was a poster from the protest that happened in 2016, and it says something about student movements, and then it compares the movements of 2015, 2016 to the COSAS uprisings in 1985. So the institution is sort of expropriating these things now, especially in we have this, I don't know to call it motto, but there's this abstract, I want to call it an abstract, it's not even 300 words, that our rector is even proclaiming out there of, we regret our role in the past, and you're sort of playing on the rhetoric that people were bringing up in 2015, more especially in this centenary year. And I think the co-option of people into all these different positions also, I think it's another part of it is also understanding sort of where these people come from and how not only just the institution as a higher education institution, but also as a capitalistic institution plays in these types of things, because they are aware that these people that they co-opt require, the sort of financial stability that one would get for working for the institution. I think perhaps the question would then be of how does this affect them on a psychological level, and sort of how does it affect their psyche as well, because I think I can't speak for others, but I can speak for myself. I think, I wasn't necessarily co-opted into it. I know perhaps I have a different understanding of being co-opted into something. But there's sort of this tension that arises when you are aware of sort of why you're in a space, and you sort of directly and sort of systematically also trying to shift things and receiving this lashback. And another thing is when one goes into such spaces, given sort of the formation and molding that one has from these spaces of consciousness, there's also this notion of who the enemy is. And I think when you get there and you're confronted with a different type of enemy, I think I can't pronounce this, but Nyamjo writes about this in the book RhodesMustFall of not every black man is black enough or something to sort of that thing. So I think it's also that confrontation, especially in a space like this, that many people aren't prepared for when they go into these sort of spaces that also sort of, it takes you aback because you're like, I walked in knowing who the enemy is, and now, you know, Vanessa is the one who's sort of like coming for me, and sort of how, you know, it's that thing of how do you mediate sort of that type of thing that I believe is sort of what's most pressing for people, because you know the enemy you're going for, and you know, you sort of have theorized, and you know how I'm going to attack, you know, whatever the case may be, and then Vanessa, who is, you know, looks like me, I would assume thinks like me, is the one who comes to me. I don't know how to respond. I wasn't trained. I wasn't ready for that. So I think it's perhaps that affects people more, especially in an environment like Stellenbosch, perhaps with that in mind. And then I think to respond to the other question of the institutional culture, and more especially in regards to our residents and program committees in our half-seasons. So I drew this on the board because I'm not sure if everyone understands sort of how SRC sort of operates and how it's also formed. So our SRC has 15 members on it. There's 9 elected members, and those are the ones that come sort of when people campaign and so forth. There's 9 people that are eventually elected onto the SRC. And then the rest of the people, my maths is bad now, but the rest of the people come, 6 people, sort of come from within these other bodies. And then the program committee has 2 seats, and as of recently, a couple of months ago, there was a constitutional amendment that the SRC did under very suspicious circumstances, whereby they added an additional seat for the program committee. So our program committee at Stellenbosch operates in sort of a silo, and I've brought this up on many occasions before, because unlike the rest of our other structures which are managed by student affairs and sort of receive funding and so forth from student affairs under the division of Professor Spoonwinkle, our Vice Director for Teaching and Learning, our program committee receives funding independently from our Centre for Student Communities, which is sort of under the office of the Corpus, if anybody is aware of who that is. So our program committee sort of exists, and so each resident and each private student organization has a primaria, and then there'll be a vice primaria, and all of those people then will go through in a structure which is called our PIACA, which is our program committee of Stellenbosch University. So the program committee has this notion, their understanding of representation is that it's numerical. So given the fact that there's so many people in residences and so many people in PSOs who vote for them, which is not always the case, they believe that they hold more structural power. And to a certain extent, they do, because they have direct access to the students on the ground. And sort of how that culture, institutional sort of exclusive culture is maintained, is that so although we work from the student constitution, which comes and is mandated and run by the SRC, the program committee has its own constitution, and from that, all the residences have their own sub-constitutions that they abide by. Many of these sub-constitutions are still in Afrikaans. Many residences still don't want to change these constitutions that they have. And many of the constitutions are also very problematic. I can elaborate on that another time. So what happens is that in many of these places we have these rituals, sort of these initiation rituals that still occur up until this day. Many students have spoken out against these rituals. Many of the students who do speak out against the rituals are either excluded from within those resident spaces themselves and given the option to leave, because the notion that's always brought forth is we don't force anyone to participate, it's your choice to participate in these rituals. So the institutional culture is definitely still maintained by these committees because of the fact that power has been so decentralized. And also I think it's the understanding that each of these bodies, and perhaps flawed understanding that they have of what the role of the SRC actually is, because I can speak on many occasions myself, where I went and I engaged with our program committee, our cluster conveners, because we have clusters here in Stellenbosch, which similarly to how the government merged institutions to distribute resources and so forth, the sort of a similar model we followed at Stellenbosch, where we've put residences and PSOs and clusters sort of equally distribute resources, sort of similar to that. But how they maintain these things by this notion of freedom. So we all have free will within these things, but also because people want to belong, some people play into that problematic institutional culture, and people perpetuate it as well, because there's also
we have lots of legacy students on our campus. So many people will say, because my dad was the prim of Dagbreek, I also must be the prim of Dagbreek. And because my dad gives X amount to Dagbreek, you must make me the prim of Dagbreek. And then once I get to be the prim of Dagbreek, I then have that platform to spread my ideology, not only in Dagbreek, but also within the prim committee itself. So, I mean, if your question is around institutional culture, I definitely can say that this is where, you know, primarily where our institutional culture sort of still lies, and it's perpetuated in these rituals. If you understand the as a culture itself, it's in these rituals, it's in these euphemisms, and everything else that exists from here that still enables the culture to continue. Because the prim committee also views the SRC as being a resource body. So they don't see the need to participate in the SRC. It's a resource body for them. And it's a mechanism where they just have to sit there, sort of tick a box and say, I've attended the meeting, and then that's sort of where it lies. Because they don't believe that they have to do anything. They believe our mandate is to deal with sort of operational issues in the prim committee, and we don't want to tackle any things of transformation and so forth, because that's the SRC's problem, not our problem itself. So if you're looking for who to engage with regarding institutional culture, you're more than welcome to engage with being a cluster convener yourself. You know, this is perhaps where you'd start in tackling such things. That's my key takeaway.
I think that's time for one, two questions. One at the back there. Anybody else? Burning answers.
No, Stephen.
Oh. For two, I've got two.
I just wanted to, I think that probably I'm the only person from Tygerberg here, that you guys are really tackling a whole beast, honestly. There's so much you can say, and from Tygerberg side, maybe we shouldn't have started with that because I'm visiting Tygerberg. All of this doesn't exist. The university to us, or from just as a student on Tygerberg campus, literally it's a business. I am there to do what I need to do. People who sit on our TSR they ran for it. It's not, quite honestly, people who ran this year, I think there was 9 spots. It was 10 people. You just have to eliminate one. And it literally was that because people are not interested in these structures. They don't believe that these structures work. They don't believe that there's any progress. And hence, even when we get the SRC emails that we need to participate in X, Y, and Z, we just overlook them. It's spam. It's spam mail, honestly. And I think it comes from the point where we don't understand what's happening on main campus. And even having that divide, I know I always say this, we live on Tiger Island. You have a sector of students who honestly don't feel a part of the entire institution in general. They're not included in the entire space. We always get the whole thing, no, we are the cream of the crop that just lives there. We are the cream of the crop that has these privileges, we pay the most, and all the privileges come to you guys, etc., etc. And I think that feeds on to how they review our institution, how we view also the leadership structures, and how we just perceive the entire structure. Do we want to be a part of it? Will we come back and plow back into Stellenbosch University? I doubt it. Majority, we go, we graduate, we leave. Black students can't wait to leave because we face the same things as you. We don't feel like we belong in Stellenbosch. Because as much as we can say we have, there's a certain amount of others, white and others, the others is filled with Indian students. The amount of black students in my class, we're all friends, we know each other. And yes, I'm being a bit dramatic, but my point is that there is that what you feel here, we feel it 10 times more. Because even in the hospital, the patriarchal structure persists. We couldn't have anything like Open Stellenbosch in Tygerberg because those are the same examiners who will you will be subjected to them when you have an oral exam. You don't want to be on the forefront of a strike because that could be your examiner. And you know, you can't say anything after that exam because it's at their discretion as a clinician. So there's a lot, and it's not only here that you face issues. Also, those tiny islands have a lot of issues as well. And that's why I'm saying it's a beast we
much that still needs to be discussed, even with the whole black division. Unfortunately, as black people or the other, there's the black people who understand poverty, and there's the black people who don't understand poverty, etc., etc., and that we also experience a lot. And we still can't come to some consensus of how we should go about that. So I think I'm so thankful that you're having this discussion, and you guys are far ahead than where we are at Heidelberg. And hopefully you guys will come across and add some light as well to our island.
Stephen?
Yeah, well, I don't know what to say after that, because I think that's absolutely right. I imagine in engineering, you have a similar situation, so maybe the arts faculty is slightly different to other faculties on Stellenbosch. So how does one think through that? I mean, if one can't bring numbers to bear in terms of really getting one's voice, but one can do certain things tactically from this conversation. How does one, you said there are conversations, people that's not, it hasn't demised, it's morphed, perhaps. But what does that mean? And sometimes one doesn't need the numbers if you don't have them. There are other ways of doing it, such as this conversation and whatever. And should there be conversations in these other faculties? If things seem to have moved a little bit further in the arts faculty in terms of raising this issue. And I just want to mention, Lauren Wood has been doing research on the first black student at Stellenbosch in the 1880s, and he had an incredibly rough time, as you can imagine. Daniel Gazanik from the Eastern Cape was in theology, an extraordinary person that's well, and Lauren's looked into the archives, there's an enormous amount of material. He was a very impressive person politically, but you can imagine in the 1880s in Stellenbosch. So I think that's something else that one needs to be thinking about, powerful narratives that start circulating, the different ways of producing visibility around these issues that you're all raising.
I think, well, just to speak on the Tygerberg issue. So I have many close friends who are on Tygerberg campus who are involved in Open Stellenbosch and FeesMustFall and so forth. And I think I don't want to sound cynical, but I think like you've mentioned, the issue on Tygerberg is far more complex than I think we ourselves and just people in Stellenbosch main campus can sort of imagine. I think it goes back even further than Open Stellenbosch, so sort of how Tygerberg was sort of viewed as this island of where we just train those prestigious doctors who are just going to go off and just save and heal people, but not understanding that they have to be humans as well, and that we need to treat them as humans as well, given the type of things that you see when you're working in a hospital and also what you have to grapple with on a daily basis. And I think, I don't disagree with anything that you said because of the fact that I've had these conversations with people who are from Tygerberg themselves. When I was on my term on SRC, I tried to make it a point that I went to Tygerberg at least once a week, but I myself could not stomach what I was being told and what I was seeing and what I was experiencing. So I think what we've tried to do from sort of my term until now, not sort of praising what I did in my term, and I don't want to speak about what I did in my term, but I think it's sort of, I think the conversations sort of are what have been most powerful for me. Sort of, I think sometimes people on Tygerberg feel like they're alone, and to a certain extent they are. Because to get from here to Tygerberg is not just like a walk in the park. It's actually quite difficult. You try to take the train and it's a whole long story. And we don't have that connect with people on Tygerberg campus. We just bring them in here at the beginning of welcoming, and then after that it's like, okay, bye, I'll see you at graduation after 6, 7 years, whatever. We don't really get much into that. And I think it would go into furthering the conversations. And Melon, Vanessa and I have always said we are willing to be at, the work of the people and do the people's work. But having these conversations, and I think to go further than conversations, would actually be having the practical implementations of
what do people on Tygerberg actually, what do they need? And I think it needs to come from the students, not necessarily from management itself, and which becomes really difficult as well, because I mean, I know in military academy, for example, there's a hierarchy that they have, a military hierarchy that they have. So many of the issues that we discuss sort of in SRC, the captain would say, okay, no, I hear you guys, that's good, that's great, but this is where the conversation ends. I can't take this sort of narrative back onto my campus. So I think it would also be a thing of us understanding how the structure and systems work at Tygerberg to see how we can possibly help, you know, counter those different types of things. So I think it's in understanding the narrative and context of the place where we can know how to situate ourselves in terms of enabling students of Tygerberg to feel like they belong to not this Stellenbosch University, you know, but sort of a Stellenbosch University community that we're trying to cultivate and create. And then I think on Stephen's comment, rather, I find it interesting that you use impressive student, but we'll speak about that perhaps after the presentation. I think we'll speak about that one after the presentation. But I think it is, I mean, it is an interesting narrative, and I think it's something that it also, you know, I mean, my question around that, it would sort of be, now that you brought it up, of if we look at Daniel, you know, back then, I think I'd have to read the thesis or read the work, you know, to sort of fully comprehend. But I think it also goes back into this notion of, you know, if we bring a black face in and perhaps in speaking without reading the whole thing, you know, sort of, I think it goes back into this issue of representation that we're trying to grapple with, you know, and sort of, it would be how, you know, Daniel himself saw himself in this institution, and whether, you know, can we resonate with things that he was feeling within the 80s now, and what does that say about the so-called change that we've had in the institution, and has there been any tangible change per se, and sort of how can, you know, we sort of merge the different realities and experiences together to try make sense of, you know, where we find ourselves, of what is the black experience in South Africa and in Stellenbosch University per se. Yes, great.
Final word, I promise. I'm done. Stephen, you actually got me thinking about, I guess in some way you're really highlighting the necessity for disruption, right? To disrupt, because Daniel is a disruption, right? And this is precisely why I do think movements emerge outside of formalized structures. This exactly, they disrupt, they are antagonistic, it's almost, you know, it's a necessity for them to emerge, and not just, sure, in this case we're talking about the movement as a collective, but I think also individually, right? I imagine, for example, as tutors, right, we have disruptive work to do in our classes. I mean, Henry and I were looking through essays, and really it's appalling what people say. Like, I mean, disbelief, I cannot, I'm so shocked, you know. And so it kind of makes me wonder if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, right? So I guess perhaps this is going on a tangent, but it forces one to ask questions that are just beyond this topic primarily, and to think about what is the work of academics, what is the work of an academic, and, you know, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing, or what we imagine we should be doing? Are we disrupting what we find to be problematic? Or are we kind of just, you know, complicit going along with it because it's the status quo? It is what it is. You came to Stellenbosch, what did you expect? Right? That's what I was told in first year. Like, I literally, when I left, everyone was like, and I got home my first holiday, I still remember, I was one of those people, like, I don't want to cause trouble, I don't want, you know, like, it's okay, you know, like, but when I realized other people feel the same way, I was like, okay, this isn't right. And other people having a different experience elsewhere, clearly something's not right here, you know. So I guess it's that question of, are you willing to put yourself in the firing line, right? Because as Nomzamo has rightfully pointed out, and I guess a lot of us in this room might be able to attest, you have a lot riding on this degree, you have a lot riding on you being here. And it costs a lot to be here, not just financially, but also emotionally and so forth. So the price of disruption, what is the price of disruption? Is it worth it? And until I think we get to a point where we convince one another, or we convince other people, whoever they are, or we convince ourselves that it is worth it, I don't think we're going to get very far. That's it.
Right, thanks. Thank you, Nomzamo, Vanessa, for what I think was a tremendous end to a very interesting series. I also just want to thank Anne for all her work on a series of seminars now, which have been very interesting. We have them, as you can see, speaking about representation and disruption, we have them all on YouTube now, so I hope we can distribute these links and the conversation just as a top here. I learned a lot from today's presentation. I think it's great that we've got it on YouTube now, that other people who maybe weren't here today can possibly benefit, from that diagram amongst other things. Thank you everybody for coming.